Welcome back to 28storms.com. This is your tropical cyclone update for this Wednesday, February 23rd, 2011. Here is the latest visible animation of Tropical Cyclone Carlos. The Joint Typhoon Warning Center currently estimates the winds to be about 60 knots, which makes perfect sense since the storm is now beginning to show a very ragged eye wall, but an eye wall nonetheless, as you can see in the final frames right here. The eye wall still appears to be somewhat exposed down toward the southwest, and we'll get into some possible reason behind that in a moment. Also, here's an enhanced infrared image, and fortunately, the strongest cloud tops are displaced north of the center, and therefore some of the strongest winds and rainfall have remained away from Onslow, Exmouth, Dampier, and Port Hedland. Here's the latest water vapor image, and this also shows that quite well. If anything, it looks like we might have possibly some dry air intrusion trying to feed into the inner core coming from the land masses here, and that could be one possible reason. You can also make out the very ragged appearance on the latest microwave imagery. As you can see, here's the inner core right along the coastline between Exmouth and Onslow, but nonetheless it's still exposed or at least halfway open toward the southwest, and again, that could be due to some dry air entrainment. Also, just for good measure, here's the latest microwave imagery from SIMS, and it basically shows the same thing. Some of the strongest winds and convection are expected to remain just north of the coastlines. And I'm taking a look at some of the observations near Dampier and Onslow, and the strongest wind gusts I could find were about 64 knots. And don't get me wrong, that's fairly intense, and that can do some structural damage. But at the very least, the strongest and most damaging winds will remain offshore. And, although I do anticipate some trees to be down and some minor structural damage, we've certainly dodged a bullet in that the storm isn't overly intense, and it's taking its good old time getting its act together, and it's really not forecast to intensify much more than it currently is. Here is the latest forecast track from the Bureau of Meteorology, and as you can see, the center is passing land, but in just a few more hours, it will finally be moving away from Australia once and for all. Thereafter, it could become a Category 3 on the Australian scale, but if it does, it will be very temporary, and regardless, it's moving out to sea, and so it's not going to really affect anyone thereafter. So here is the regional visible image, and as you can see, Carlos is beginning to move on out of the picture as it begins to finally develop an eye-like feature, but again, it's moving off to the southwest, and in 12 to 24 more hours, Australia finally won't have to deal with this pain in the neck system anymore. And further toward the north, there's really not much going on at the moment. We don't have any organized disturbances, which is certainly a good thing. Although there is a broad trough of low pressure now beginning to spread across areas of Queensland into the Northern Territory and even Western Australia. Here's the latest infrared, and you can see it really quickly right here. And as you can see by observing the latest surface analysis from the Bureau of Meteorology, that surface trough extends all the way from Tropical Cyclone Carlos all the way through the Northern Territory and extending eastward into the Coral Sea and South Pacific. But over toward Darwin, we do have a broad area of 1005 millibar low pressure, so that's your lowest pressure values along the trough right here. So all of the Northern Territory regions and surrounding waters will have to be monitored in the medium range. If that trough were to persist for an extended period of time, that could be the next focal point for tropical cyclone formation. But currently over on toward the east over the Coral Sea, things are fairly quiet. The rest of the South Pacific is fairly quiet with the exception of Tropical Cyclone Atu, which of course is moving off to the southeast and really won't impact anyone directly despite its very impressive satellite presentation. And once again, as we've been saying for the last several days, all of the inner core of the storm will be passing to the north and eventually the east of New Zealand. So areas around there don't have much to worry about except for very high wave heights along the northern coast. And here's the latest forecast from the Joint Typhoon Warning Center. It's currently maxed out at 90 knots and will steadily weaken as it moves into the cooler waters of the lower latitudes while it stays away from New Zealand. Taking a very quick look at the forecast model guidance, this is the 12Z ECMWF forecast. By day 1, we see Carlos beginning to move out of the picture along with Tropical Cyclone Atu. Day 2 or 48 hours, we begin to see a broad area of low pressure begin to form near Darwin. And as we go into days 3 and 4, we begin to see a more prominent area of low pressure begin to form. Day 5 and day 6, we now have the next tropical cyclone on our hands as long as this model were to verify. And by day 7, In day 8, we almost have a carbon copy of the second half of Tropical Cyclone Carlos's track. Again, if this model were to verify, that's what we would be dealing with the storm moving on off once again between Port Hedland and Exmouth. The rest of the South Pacific, Coral Sea, and surrounding areas of Australia would be relatively quiet, barring that one tropical system moving on off to the southwest. Here is the latest GFS forecast. As we go into 36 and 48 hours, we see both of our initial two tropical cyclones moving out of the picture, with Carlos to the west and Attu to the east. And we're also beginning to see more rainfall and convection beginning to develop over the Northern Territory, and that'll have to be the area to watch, just like the European has highlighted. By 84 hours, we begin to see that low pressure begin to expand, and there is some model disagreement. So not only will we have to monitor the Southeast Indian Ocean and Timor Sea, but we're also going to have to keep a close watch on the Gulf to see if anything takes over in that region. So that still remains to be seen. We're going to have to really figure out where that main surface low is going to form before we can really make a forecast for any type of system. By 96, and let's see, this is 132 hours. Much like the European, the GFS has focused much of the low pressure off toward the southwest by this point, with much of the low pressure now between Derby and Broome and Port Hedland. And by day 7, it's continuing to move on off toward the southwest. But also notice there's a lot of convection left behind. So this whole general area along the surface trough is going to have to be watched over the next week. So thanks again for stopping by here at 28storms.com. For more tropical cyclone updates in the future, please visit 28storms.com/cyclone and youtube.com/28cyclones. Thank you and have a nice day.